that you're outlining, Bella Caledonia does what it does, Wings does what Wings does, Common Space does what Common Space does, and they're all quite different things. Common Space, we are very keen that from the editorial perspective that we are not seen to be taking sides and things. We didn't back political parties in either the general election or the Holyrood election, for example. We didn't take a position on the EU referendum either. We want to come into it with an attitude of, we come from the left, a left perspective. That was because people wanted something that would combat what they said was a right-wing media, so we're quite open about that. That's the position we're coming from. But other than that, we're non-party political and we try not to take positions on things. Now, Wings Over Scotland absolutely takes positions on things. There'd be no doubt about that. So that then would be incompatible with what we do at Common Space. We've also seen, I'm sure everyone's seen the spats that Wings and Bella have had on social media. They've fallen out and in with each other. I don't know how many times there's been, but I'm currently blocked by Wings Over Scotland. This just seems to go on social media. So the idea that all of those people could then work harmoniously together just doesn't make sense. They're too strongly opposed on what they would see as key fundamental issues for that to work. And that I think is a healthy thing. I think that what Wings does is really important. I know he's divisive, but I still think what he does is important, because there's a lot of things that we know now that we wouldn't know if it wasn't for Wings, about the way that the media works. It gave an insight into a lot of things that we wouldn't have otherwise had. There's value there. Bella Caledonia does that really kind of intellectual analysis on some of the big issues. That is incredibly valuable. And then you've got Independence Live that just do a kind of raw, unedited live stream of whatever they can get to. All of these things bring in different strengths to the new media movement, and I think that they work better as individual projects where they're all quite clear about what their own aims and objectives are.
He's good at this one, he's good at that one, she's great at that, and we'll give them all their own space to do what they need to do.
But I agree that on top of that you should have a collaborative mindset. That's one of our kind of mottos at Common Space, is collaboration, not competition. So we work with as many people as we can work with. We'll do as much as we can, we'll share resources, we'll work on stories with other outlets. That's included Wings Over Scotland, Bella Caledonia. We work more and more closely actually with Indie Live these days. They come in every week now and do a live stream of us in the editorial room, and the idea is that we want to be able to bring the funders and the readers into the newsroom itself and let them see how it works. But we've also worked collaboratively with mainstream media outlets. We give quite regularly, when we've got an investigation that we know is exclusive, we know it's going to have an impact, we'll give it to the National first, and we'll let them run it as a front page before we put it on Common Space, because we see that is then taking the funding that people are giving us and us creating content out of that and then getting it to the biggest possible audience. We're not held to those old competitive journalistic ideas about it's our story and we must have it and we must have the credit. We're not as bothered about that. If people just lift stories off Common Space, we actually see that as a good thing, because it's spreading the content out. We're not possessive really that way. We've given stuff to the Independent before, even because we had quite a London-based story once, and we thought that we could get to a UK national with that story, and the Independent took it. And we get picked up regularly, even by the Daily Mail picks up some of the stuff we do on land reform, for example. Now they'll run things from a different angle, of course, but we know that it's our content they're picking up. So it's stuff that we've managed to put out there in the public domain that wouldn't otherwise have been there. I wanted Common Space to move away from the us versus them mentality that existed in new media, and I understand why it was there. New media created itself because it felt like it was a space needed to be filled that the mainstream media wasn't filling, that services needed to be provided that were lacking, and there was a lot of anger about the way that the mainstream media had conducted itself. Totally understandable, people are right to be angry, but moving forward I thought it would be better to not go in with a we're on one side of this and you're on another side of this attitude, but rather to create content and actually get it into those channels, because by doing that you're helping correct some of those problems by getting content out there in the mainstream that would never have been there otherwise.
That was going to be my last question before I move on to talk to some of the people in the office. If the second independence referendum's coming up, a lot of people think it was a major mistake the first time round of the official Yes campaign, that they were basically begging the mainstream media to be nice, which was something that was never going to happen. Now, you've mentioned this collaborative idea, but I mean, do you think would be a a successful strategy in a second referendum to do the same thing, to try and hope the mainstream media would be nice, or would it be a better strategy to pour everything into the new media and the new things that have been created around Scottish politics at the moment?
I don't. I mean, the strategy of the official Yes campaign when it comes to media, I can only speculate on. I mean, I don't know for sure exactly what their strategy was or how they conducted their relationships with mainstream media. But I think moving forward, when it comes to new media, the advantage for a second referendum would be that in the first Indyref, the new media was still establishing itself, and it didn't quite have the full credibility necessary by that stage, I think, for official organisations to be more closely involved with them. I think they were still a bit standoffish, or they weren't quite sure who was involved in this, and getting involved with an outlet that you thought was credible and then it turns out that they're not very credible could be damaging to campaigns, for example. Now we're in a position where the new media has established itself. It's kind of professionalised itself much more, and to the point where mainstream media will pick up our stories. Politicians speak to us, happily speak to us. They submit opinion pieces to Common Space. The Scottish elections, we even had Kezia Dugdale submitted an opinion piece. We've just had the CEO of Ineos Shale submit an opinion piece, which has caused a bigger story that the Herald picked up. Now we're not going out and sourcing that; they're coming to us. They went through exactly the same channels to submit an opinion piece as a grassroots activist would. So they're seeing a value, obviously, in new media, and it's not necessarily just coming from the Yes side. It's more broad than that. They understand that the new media is able to speak to audiences in a way that mainstream media isn't able to. And so I think in a second Indyref you would see, I would expect a different approach on that, on the way that the official campaigns deal with the media. An interesting thing that I did hear was sources told me. They were talking to someone in the Greens who deals with media things, and they'll submit pieces to different outlets and they'll monitor and track how they perform and how people react to them. And I think an article had been published by the Herald, like an opinion style article from someone in the Greens, and a similar style piece had been published in Common Space as well. It was on like the same subject or something like that, and they noticed that the piece, which was broadly quite similar, performed much better when Common Space published it than it did when it was published by the mainstream media outlet. It was shared a lot more than on social media than the mainstream media outlet's version of that similar article. So there's definitely an advantage in the new media. There's a trust among the new media outlets. People prefer to share things quite often from us than they do from mainstream media outlets because they still feel that hostility towards them. So when it comes to PR and communications, that's exactly what PR and comms teams are looking for. It's not just about where you're putting the content, but is it shareable? Is it doing the rounds on social media? Is it getting maximum exposure? And that seems to be something that new media offers in a way that the mainstream outlets don't so much. So there's some interesting differences if you're looking at it from a comms perspective as to how the new media could be a lot more beneficial.
For a moment, thanks Angela.
Thank you.
Now I'm sitting with Ben Wray, who works on the Commonweal on the policy documents at Wray. So how did you get involved with it at first?
Well, I've been involved for years now. Before Commonweal actually started, I was working with Robin on the Jimmy Reid Foundation, which was the previous project which Commonweal emerged out of originally after the independence referendum. Commonweal became its own independent organisation in October 2014. So I've been involved on research and policy stuff since about the start of 2013. So how long's that now? That's
3.5 years.
3.5 years, yeah.
Were you a political person before? Was it something you kind of fell into, or were you always interested?
Well, I met Robin, the director, through activism, pro-independence activism. Was involved in setting up the Radical Independence campaign. So what you generally find is a lot of these. Scotland's quite a small place, and Scottish politics is even smaller. So people end up meeting each other, and usually a lot of people that get involved in politics long term, it's because they've came through some sort of activist experience. So my formative experiences, things like the Iraq War, financial crisis, and then the independence referendum, have all sort of informed been working in politics full time now.
What is it that you write about in particular?
Well, so I coordinate policy and research work for Commonwealth. So it's kind of, Commonwealth used to just be a kind of think tank organisation. Now it's spread arms and legs and other things. It's kind of more a broader organisation. But I deal with just specifically the think tank aspect of it. Basically producing ideas, policy ideas, and doing research work that's trying to put across a vision for Scotland that we call an all of us first vision. That's about equality and about policies that are getting beyond what the neoliberal pro-capitalist agenda that's dominated policy and politics in Scotland and Britain for the last 20 years.
These reports, obviously people download them. You can usually download them as a PDF and people will read them, but do they get any play in the Parliament? Is there people that pick them up? Do you get politicians or trade unions or whoever? Do people come and take the reports? So
if we only produced the reports and stuck them on our website, then it would have quite limited influence, to be honest. What we try to do is have a lobbying effort, basically, to advocate for what's in the reports. So, we produced a report on childcare earlier in the year, and we had a meeting with the Early Years Minister about it. We got a big story in the Sunday Herald about it. So you need to do all these things. Unfortunately, it's a necessary part of trying to get anything done, that you try to speak to the right people and convince them to do it. And I think our ideas have had some influence. It's always difficult to tell how much of your ideas get turned into policy, because by the time they come out in bills, they never look like they're never going to associate directly with something like Commonweal. But I think there's definitely evidence that the ideas have had influence. So I'll give you an example. The Scottish Government set up something called the Working Together Review into workplace relations, industrial relations, about 2 weeks after we published a report into industrial relations called Working Together. So it was quite clear, and the chairperson of the committee that they set up was an author of our report. So it's quite clear that had a direct influence on what the government were thinking about that issue. So we can have influence from time to time. Not all of our stuff gets anywhere with the government. It's just too radical, whatever. The SNP are. They're not going to take up all of Commonwealth's ideas, but we certainly can have influence with some of the stuff that we produce.
Yeah, I'm sure it's probably a person whose philosophy you don't agree with, and neither do I, but was it Milton Friedman? And he said that, one of the things when there's a crisis is that you have to have your ideas lying around to be picked up. Although I don't agree with his ideas, do you think there's something in that idea? I think
there is, yeah. I think if you haven't developed a sort of way of looking at the world that makes sense, then when things do happen, you're not in a position to respond to it. So I think if you look at the financial crisis in 2008, looking back on it now, it's quite clear to me that there was a dearth of left-wing solutions on offer to the big issues of the day, and that let the banking class off with it.
Let them run amok with it.
Exactly, absolutely. To such an extent that they're probably in a more powerful position now than they were before the financial crisis, because they've got this what they call moral hazard, whereby they can do what they want and they know the state will always provide them with cash, even if what they're doing is essentially totally negligent. So I definitely believe that's the case. Actually, we need to develop ideas in preparation for big situations, but also for now. I mean, the situation in Scotland is quite an interesting one right now, whereby we've got potentially another referendum coming. So we're kind of got on a bit of a war footing about that. We're producing policy papers about the new case for independence now. Just the other day we produced a report about currency, what sort of Scottish currency options you could have now after Brexit.
Do you think that was a mistake the first time?
Definitely, and the whole debate's moved on because of Brexit, whereby currency union is not even, it's not a realistic possibility anymore. So when the political situation changes, it can open up space for something like Commonweal, and Brexit has opened up a bit of space for us to say, well, here's some new ideas on currency that you can take up, and I think those ideas will have a bit of influence.
So where do you think we're going now? That's the hardest question at the moment, because everything's a wee bit up in the air.
It is a tough question. Immediately after Brexit, I thought an independence referendum was definitely on the agenda. I'm not so sure now. I think Nicola Sturgeon's, it's all smoke and mirrors, but I think Nicola Sturgeon's approach now is to say, let's see how the negotiations go and if negotiations go badly, then maybe we'll do it. But the negotiations could take years. It could take 2 to 3 years. So by that stage, you don't know what the situation is going to be then.
And Theresa May's putting it off as well. She's putting it
exactly.
back. You think they're trying to? Do you think?
I think Theresa May's partly using Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish Government,